Wow. All right. Why do terms borrowed from human social hierarchies acquire such remarkable weight when plant-animal relations are described? Do ecosystems really have a king of the beasts and lowly serfs? Do certain insects enslave others? Does one species exploit another? One second. The promiscuous use of these terms in ecology raises many far-reaching issues. That the terms are laden with socially charged values is almost too obvious to warrant extensive discussion. Many individuals exhibit a pathetic gullibility in the way they deal with nature as a dimension of society. A snarling animal is neither vicious nor savage, nor does it misbehave or earn punishment because it reacts appropriately to certain stimuli. By making such anthropomorphic judgments about natural phenomena, we deny the integrity of nature. Even more sinister is the widespread use of hierarchical terms to provide natural phenomena with intelligibility or order. What this procedure does accomplish is reinforce human social hierarchies by justifying the command of men and women as innate features of the natural order. Human domination is thereby transcribed into the genetic code as biologically immutable, together with the subordination of the young by the old, women by men, and men by men. The very promiscuity with hierarchical terms are used to organize all differentia in nature is inconsistent. Queen bee does not know she is a queen. The primary activity of the beehive is reproductive, and its division of labor, to use the grossly abused phrase, lacks any meaning in a large sexual organ that performs no authentic economic function. The purpose of the hive is to create more bees. The honey that animals and people acquire from it is a natural largesse. Largesse? Within the ecosystem, bees are adapted more to meeting plant reproductive needs by spreading pollen than to meeting important animal needs. The analogy between a beehive and a society, an analogy social theorists have often found too irresistible to avoid, is a striking commentary on the extent to which our vision of nature are shaped by self-serving social interests. To deal with so-called insect hierarchies, the way we deal with so-called animal hierarchies, or worse, to grossly ignore the very different functions animal communities perform, is analogic reasoning carried to the point of the preposterous. Primates relate to each other in ways that seem to involve dominance and submission for widely disparate reasons. Yet terminologically and conceptually, they are placed under the same hierarchical rubric as insect societies, despite the different forms they assume and their precarious stability. Baboons on the African savanna have been signaled out as the most rigid hierarchical troops in the net world. This rigidity evaporates once we examine their ranking order in a forest habitat. On the savannas, it is questionable whether alpha male rule, control, or coordinate relationships with the troops, boards, such as which have a clearly different meaning when it is used in a human social context. Seemingly patriarchal primates harems can be loose sexually can be as loose sexually as brothels, depending on whether a female is in truths, changes have occurred in the habitat, or the patriarch is simply diffident about the whole situation. Baboons, it is worth noting, are monkeys. Despite the presumed similarity of their savanna habitat of early hominoids, they branched off from the hominoid evolutionary tree more than 20 million years ago. Our closest evolutionary cousin, the great apes, tend to demolish these prejudices about hierarchy completely. Of the four great apes, gibbons have no apparent ranking system at all. Chimpanzees, regarded by many primologists as the most human-like of all apes, form such fluid kind of stratification, and depending upon the ecology of an area, which may be significantly affected by research workers, establish such unstable type of association that the word hierarchy becomes an obstacle to understanding their behavioral characteristics. Orangutans seem to have little of what could be called dominance and submission relations. The mountain gorilla, despite its formidable reputation, exhibits very little stratification except for predator challenges and internal aggression. All these examples help to justify Lee's Holdings' complaint that the primate behavior model, favored by overly hierarchical and patriarchal writers on animal-human parallels, is based more on the baboon, not the gibbon. In contrast to the baboon, observed, observes Baldwin, the gibbon is closer to us physically and, one might add, on the primate evolutionary scale. Our choice of a primate role model is clearly culturally determined, she concludes. Who wants to be like the aggressive vegetarian, like the unaggressive vegetarian food-sharing gibbons? Their father is as much involved in child rearing as mother is, and where everyone lives in small family groups while little aggression beyond that. Little aggression beyond that. Much better to match the baboons, who live in large, tightly knit groups carefully closed against outside baboons, where everyone knows who is in charge, and where mother looks after the babies while father is out hunting and fishing. In fact, Baldwin concedes too much about the savanna dwelling primates. Even if the term dominance is stretched to include queen bees and alpha baboons, specific acts of coercion by individual animals can hardly be called domination. Acts do not constitute institution, episodes to what make a history. Acts do not constitute institution, episodes to what make an history. And highly structured insect behavior patterns, rooted in instinctual drives, are flexible to be regarded as social. Unless hierarchy is to be used in cosmic sense, dominance and submission must be viewed as institutionalized relationships. Relationships that living things literally institute to create, but which are neither ruthlessly fixed by instinct on the one hand, nor idiosyncratic on the other. By this I mean that they must comprise a clearly social structure of coercive and privileged ranks that exist apart from the idiosyncratic individuals who seem to be dominant within a given community. A hierarchy that is guided by a social logic beyond individual interactions or inborn patterns of behavior. And I'm going to the footnote here. An important distinction must be made here between the word community and society. Animals and even plants certainly form communities. Ecosystems would be meaningless without conceiving animals, plants, and their abiotic substance, a nexus of relationships that ranges from the intraspecific to the interspecific level. In their interactions, life forms thus behave communally in the sense that they are independent in one way or another. Among certain species, particularly primates, this nexus of interdependent relationships may be so closely linked that it approximates a society or at least a rudimentary form of society. But society, however deeply it may be rooted in nature, is nevertheless more than a community. What makes human society unique communities is the fact that they are institutionalized communities that are highly often rigidly structured around clearly manifest forms of responsibility, association, and personal relationships in maintaining the material means of life. Although societies are necessarily communities, many communities are not societies. One may find nascent social elements in animal communities, but only human beings form societies, that is, institutionalized communities. The failure to draw this distinction between animal or plant communities and human societies has produced considerable ideological mischief. Thus, predation within animal communities has been spaciously identified with war. Individual linkage between animal with hierarchy and domination, animal foraging, foraging and metabolism with labor and economics. All the latter are strictly social. My remarks are not intended to oppose the notion of society to community, but to take note of the distinctions between the two that emerge when human societies develop beyond the level of animal plant communities. Back to the reading. Such traits are evident enough in human society when we speak of self-perpetuating bureaucracies and explore them without considering the individual bureaucrats who compose them. Yet when we turn to non-human primates, what people commonly recognize as hierarchy, status, and domination are precisely the idiosyncratic behaviorism of individual animals. Like in Van Ludwig Godwell, alpha chimpanzee acquires his status by rambunctiously charging upon a group of males while noisily hitting two empty kerosene cans. At which point in her narrative, Van Ludwig Goodwell wonders, would Mike have become an alpha male without the kerosene cans? He replies that the animal's use of man-made objects is probably an indication of superior intelligence. Whether, whether such shadowy distinction in intelligence, rather than aggressiveness, willfulness, or arrogance, produce an alpha male or not, is evidence more of the subtle projection of historically conditioned human values on a primate group than the scientific objectivity that ontology likes to claim for itself. Seemingly hierarchical traits of many animals are more like variations in the links of a chain than organized stratification of the links of the kind we find in human societies and institutions. Even the so-called class societies of the Northwest Indians, as we shall see, are chain-like links between individuals rather than class-like links between strata that early Euro-American invaders so naively projected on Indians from their own social world. Acts do not constitute institutions, and episodes do not constitute history. Individual behavior traits do not form strata or classes. I want to repeat this sentence. If acts do not constitute institutions, and episodes do not constitute history, individual behavior traits do not form strata or classes. Social strata are made of internal. They have a life of their own, apart from the personalities who give them substance. Interesting. Something that immediately jumped into me because I love to synthesize different bodies of work that I feel have deep connections, but are not necessarily or intuitively seem connected. Because I'm making my way through a lot of Deleuze Gilles Deleuze, and especially his work with Guattari. Um, Few things. Like one is the how they bring us back to the molecular multiplicity. So when they observe like why fascism happens, they say that we need to ask ourselves not how fascism happens on the kind of molar aggregate, on the institutionalized, on the kind of collective level, but rather ask ourselves, what are the molecular processes that make desire its own oppression? The molecular, it's the machinic, the small, tiny, infinitesimal little processes of desire being organized through the subjects in a particular society. And I think here it's a um, I'm seeing the connection because he's talking about the difference between communities that we see in nature and society that humans form, which is about institutionalized power and domination. While in nature, you can see certain aggressive or violent acts within a certain community by an individual or individuals, but that doesn't constitute a system of hierarchy and domination. And another thing that is actually from Deleuze's logic of sense, it is talking about this inherent paradox or contradiction that exists within society, a social machine, where on one hand, in order for the society to be perceived as a stable thing, it has all of its codes of conduct, its rules, its bureaucratic institutions, and so on, have to be perceived all at once. And on the other hand, like everything else in nature and all of the things that this society is dependent upon to exist, like the bodies and resources and territory, nature, and all that kind of stuff, those things are always in progress, always in a process of becoming. Paradox that also exists in language, when on one hand you have like two main, like the main structure of language is we have signifiers and that which is signified on the other hand. So the signifier is like things like a state, the crown, a tree, even, or anything that signifies something. It kind of pretends like that thing is a stable thing. Like when we say the crown can signify a lot of things. It can be a physical crown, it can be the king or the queen, it can be the well, forms of power that they enact, it could be all kinds of things. Same for a tree, same for a state or anything. And so the signifier is pointing towards something that is seemingly stable, while the signified is never a stabilized thing. So that also reminds me this, like this difference between how we perceive society as this like stable thing when at the end of the day it's made out of individuals, it's made out of the bureaucrats, the molecular machinic movements that exist within the seemingly stable individuals or personalities within that structure. I don't know, I find this distinction here very poignant and very interesting. What do you guys think? Feel free to unmute and speak. Um, Otherwise, we can continue. All right. Anybody wants to continue reading from here? All right. I guess I will continue. Everybody can hear me okay? Everything is working well? Yes. Are you there? Okay. Um, and I'm going to continue another paragraph. Uh, all right. How is ecology to avoid the analogic reasoning that has made so much of ethology and sociology seem like spacious projections of human society into nature? Are there any terms that provide a common meaning to unity in diversity, natural spontaneity, and non-hierarchical relations in nature and society? In view of the many tenets that appear in natural ecology, why stop with these alone? Why not introduce other, perhaps less savory ecological notions like predation and aggression into society? In fact, nearly all of these questions become major issues in social theory in the early part of the century, when the so-called Chicago School of Urban Sociology zealously tried to apply almost every known concept of natural ecology to the development of the physiology of the city. Robert Park, Ernst Burgers, and Roderick Mackenzie, enamored of the new science, actually imposed stringently biological model on their studies of Chicago, the resourcefulness and inspiration that dominated American urban sociology for 2 generations. Their tenets include ecological succession, spatial distribution, zonal distribution, anabolic catabolic, no idea what it is, anabolic catabolic balance, and even competition and natural selection that could easily have pushed the school towards an insidious form of social Darwinism had it not been for the liberal biases of its founders. Despite its admirable empirical results, the school was to founder on its metaphoric reductionism. Applied indiscriminately, the categories ceased to be meaningful. When Park compared the emergence of certain specialized municipal utilities to successional dominance by other plant species that climaxes in a beach of pine forest, analogy was patently forced and absurdly controlled. This comparison of ethnic, cultural, occupational, and economic groups to plant invasion revealed a lack of theoretical discrimination that reduced human social features to plant ecological features. What Dark and his associates lack was the philosophical equipment for singling out phases that both unite and separate natural and social phenomena in a developmental continuum. This merely superficial similarity became outright identity, with the unfortunate result that social ecology was repeatedly reduced to natural ecology. The richly mediated evolution of the natural into the social that could have been used to yield a meaningful selection of ecological categories was part of the school's theoretical equipment. Whether we ignore the way human social relationships transcend plant-animal relationships, whenever we ignore the way human social relationships transcend plant and animal relationships, our views tend to bifurcate in two erroneous directions. Either we succumb to a heavy-handed dualism that harshly separates the natural from the social, or we fall into a crude reductionism that dissolves one into the other. In our case, we really cease to think out the issue involved. We merely grasp for the least uncomfortable solution to a highly complex problem, namely to analyze the phases through which mute biological nature increasingly becomes conscious human nature. Makes unity in diversity in nature more than a suggestive ecological metaphor for unity in diversity in society. The underlying philosophical concept of wholeness. By wholeness, and varying levels of actualization, an unfolding of the wealth of particularities that are latent in yet developed potentiality. This potentiality may be a newly planted seed, a newly born infant, a newly born community, or a newly born society. When Hegel describes in a famous passage the unfolding of human knowledge in biological terms, the feat is almost exact. The bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Similarly, when a fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant. And the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. These forms are not just distinguished from one another, they also supplant one another as mutually incompatible. At the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments makes them moments of an organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each needs but at the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments of organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is as necessary as the other. And this mutual necessity alone constitutes the life of the whole. I've turned to this remarkable passage because Hegel does not mean it to be merely metaphoric. The biological example and his social subject matter converge in ways that transcend both, notably a single aspect of a large process. Life itself, the distinguished from the non-living, emerges from the inorganic latent, which all the particularities it has imminently produced from the logic of its most nascent form of self-organization. So do society, as distinguished from biology, humanity as distinguished from animality, and individuality as distinguished from humanity. It is no spiteful manipulation of Hegel's famous maxim, true is the whole, to declare that the whole is the true. One can take reversal of terms to mean that the true lies in the self-consummation of a process through its development, in the flowering of its latent particularities into their fullness or wholeness, just as the potentialities of a child achieves expression in the wealth of expression and the physical growth that enters into adulthood. Mm. I love this um, two dimensions that he's traversing between like deeply philosophically grounded and also ecologically sound. Like it's such a unique combination. It doesn't happen very often in literature. And I think this is exactly what he's trying to communicate here of how when we do either or, our understanding tends to collapse. And we have when we oversimplify the processes of the ecology and, for example, compare plant communities to human societies, we oversimplify and collapse a lot of the meanings. Same when we compare the individual aggression of certain primates to um, institutionalized social forms of domination. And instead, what we need to look at is this, what he calls unity in diversity, in which all of the differentiations and singularities and multiplicities form potentialities that constantly evolve in an ever never-ending process. The wholeness, not unity, diversity, not fragmentation and separation. I don't know. I find it interesting. What do you guys think? I want to hear you a little bit. I'm speaking enough.
I love um, conversation like the topics of wholeness and philosophy intermingling with reality is just how my brain works. So this definitely speaks so true. And I think that we are just so subject to binary thinking and reductionism, just by the way our society is created, that I often find myself kind of going back to this caveat of what things, quote unquote, actually are and how they actually work together. And so it's refreshing to see it this way. I just think that in my experience, when I try to go that route in normal conversations, people get frustrated because sometimes it's not the point, right? So I think that people are so focused on what's in front of them. I would be curious to hear how to incorporate this more skillfully into like regular conversations with people. Um, because it's just so important to point out, but also when is the right time, how to do it, all of that definitely plays a role. But like this just like the way that he describes things definitely hits so true. And I've kind of been waiting for to hear um, people talk this way about our reality.
I was going to add on to that. It honestly reminds me of our current reality because the current reality we're also living in is a reality of anti intellectualism. There's a strong backlash when it comes to the STEM majors and philosophy and all of those things. And that's partially one of the reasons why people are starting to get into this binary thinking because of the consistent rampant anti-intellectualism and the channels that reinforce that, such as social media and a lot of other technological sources. This honestly reminds me how important this is, but it also reminds me of the challenges of how we can try to encourage this in this reality.
Yeah, I think the binary thinking is something I often actually do bring up in conversations is the fact that, yeah, like anti-intellectualism and also just reducing things to this or that, um, kind of supports the sensationalism that drives monetization of any industry. So it just comes full circle always.
Yeah, as if philosophy is a thing rather than a process by which we discover, articulate, and create the realities that we live in. It's like, you look at physics and the way that how it informs our worldview and how that informs the way that we interact with reality and the kind of realities it generates. It's the same way, like philosophy is trying to understand the nature of reality and it's a process. I think rejecting that as a wholesale thing is a pretty peculiar and bizarre phenomenon. I don't know. Never understood that.
Yeah, just last thing I'll add is I'm in a different book club and we're reading, well, I'm listening to it, Calling In. Um and it's very theory based. And before I even started reading, the one, not even critique, but that's the one thing that people were saying, like it's not very instructional, it's very theory based. And that kind of speaks to the way that people think about theory, because to me the instructions mean nothing without theory. um so I think that kind of proves your point there.
Yeah, I don't see theory and action as separated things. Like models that we have about reality inform the way that we interact with reality. They're inseparable. Um, yeah. And I think this is why books like that are so important, because like he's really going into the metaphysic and the metacognition elements of how we perceive our reality as a species, communities, societies evolving um, in an ecological process. Um, Something else that came to me that he was mentioning, what was it? How I, whether we ignore the way human social relationships transcend plant-animal relationships, our view tends to bifurcate in two erroneous directions. Either we succumb to a heavy-handed dualism that harshly separates the natural from the social, or we fall into crude reductionism that dissolves the one into the other. In either case, we really cease to think out the issues involved. We merely grasp for the least comfortable solution to highly complex problems, namely, the need to analyze the phases through which mute biological nature increasingly becomes conscious human nature. And I think specifically, not elaborating on that a lot more than that, but this what brings up for me is this, the problem of consciousness. The more the more we explore, the more we realize that so-called problem only arises when we perceive consciousness as phenomena that arises and emerges from an otherwise what he calls mute biological nature. But when we start seeing, not in a way that reduces or collapses, but when we start seeing that a conscious experience exists, and the more we explore, the more we understand about uh, biological world, the more it becomes evident everything is conscious. And that consciousness is everything. It's not an emergent phenomena in a dualistic, uh, emergent as in a dualistic way. Material become complex enough that consciousness arises because consciousness is everywhere. Um, just another anecdote that kind of brought up for me.
I wanted to add on to that if you don't mind. Um, what you said there in regards about human relationships, it honestly reminds me of the loneliness epidemic because there is a loneliness. I cannot speak for other countries nor the country you live in Mexico, but the United States has a significant loneliness epidemic. And when you were mentioning that, I was thinking about how even making a relationship itself is starting to become a struggle here. And I wonder that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the situations as it is going on in the world.
I was just going to add that because to me, I'm always relating the general ecology to the way that we regard like our biology and stuff. And when you think about epigenetics and the way that we only know like the tip of the iceberg of what our genes are capable of and what we only kind of study what is presenting versus the way that everything else can come about that is already in existence, but may not arise in our quote unquote consciousness until the environment pushes in one or the other direction. So I thought that was interesting. That's the note I made for that one. The way it again like comes full circle to the science that we know, but we are so short-sighted that we can't zoom out and see how it applies on a grander scheme.
Apropos what you said about loneliness, I think from an ecological standpoint, there's plenty to say about the alienation of anthropomorphism and human-centric ways of being, which from which result all of this kind of view of nature as something that is either completely separated from our societies and behavioral behavior, or something that collapses into each other completely without distinction and differentiation. And that creates natural alienation of kind of like a void of intimacy. Um, I wrote on Substack towards post-human intimacy, trying to kind of point towards this post-anthropomorphic, post-human um, forms of intimacy, and how intimacy can be found everywhere, not just in the how desire was organized to want love and in romantic relationships in particular structures of exclusivity and ownership and marriage and all of these kind of institutions, rather intimacy that can be found anywhere. Ancestral chains of wisdom, the kind of other inhabitants all around us, the soil itself, the cycles, and the entire biosphere that we are part of and inhabiting. Um, I think a lot of the conversation about how to tend to this so-called loneliness pandemic misses that kind of essential point of anthropomorphism as a worldview, and is why it's so important to engage with theory because we don't if we don't get to that point, the conversation remains at a level that doesn't really go deep enough to reimagine the worldviews that create such social phenomena. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think if we're talking sort of about the obsession with the alpha, you know, primate dynamic, within different breeds, and how that's different different cultures of monkeys and baboons and gibbons, sort of like what is the culture obsessing over that alpha male dominance archetype, right? And then sort of like the if we think of pyramid schemes, or different influencers, where like massive influencers are promoting sort of the the hyper masculinized lifestyles, right? Sort of the glorification of the kings, and how that sort of gets perverted, or causes like otherness that we're sort of talking about, like the separation from like the right, like if I'm not an alpha, then I'm a beta, or whatever, the very binary look at a alpha beta kind of fluidity, right? Even if you think of it as like natural law, but it's not like the monkey goes out and thinks like I'm the alpha or whatever. It's more like I'm the biggest ape that can fight the hardest, or you know what I mean, can harvest the most food. Which as there's obviously like the spectrum of all the creatures that do all the work, you know. So
Yeah, like
and it,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, no, not only the notion of alpha, like he says, is a human projection that looks at
Right.
individual acts of aggression within a particular group as like and project it onto a systematized, institutionalized sense of hierarchy and domination. But even more hilarious than that, which he's not getting to here because I think it was written and explored after his time. Oh, I don't know. The whole notion of alpha comes from this guy. I don't remember his name even. Not a very important one. Was observing wolves And he observed this kind of, oh, there's the alpha kind of dynamic. Turns out, and he kind of refuted his own stuff later on in his career, but it turns out that he was observing them in captivity.
Mm.
When wolves are in the wild, they are there is no such dynamic. They actually have a very kind of democratic and kind of collective, communal way of being. Everybody hunts together, everybody shares, everybody. So even only is it ridiculous in the first place, but even the thing itself is based on a completely fabricated, which I think speaks directly to what he's talking about here, which separates the phenomena from the material realities that it's part of. I think he said it in previous, something about like how um, histories are being created by this series of events, and how I don't remember where it was. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's like like the true nature being out in the wild, sort of how the community of wolves would, congregate or operate in that natural environment versus, sort of how the energy is displaced or compensated in a containment, inside a box sort of reduction of natural flow, or sort of, how interference on that scientific part even causes uh, the results to be construed, obstructed, like what is actually going to happen in a natural environment. But it's like the zoo, the zoo aspect of the science alters the results. It's the same. There's an interesting thing with like mice, research mice, lab mice that have been breeded for decades inside that have a abnormal telomere length. So when they're doing like lifespan research on these research mice, they have skewed results because of the sort of way the mice are bred. Something that Brett Weinstein talked about. So yeah, I totally see that being uh, sort of like containment research, captive research. Also, like if we think of humans being captive in the capitalist or fascist research project, that tends to skew the results of a community research or it's community dynamics and stuff. Anyway,
yeah. I just have to say that the Weinsteins are pretty problematic figures. Just
yeah,
doesn't mean that anything they say are not, but they are kind of um, pretty prominent figures in the movement of anti-intellectualism, anti-science, anti-academia right now. So
yeah.
it doesn't refute anything and everything they ever said. It might be have valid points to it, but just something to
I totally agree with that assessment of the Weinsteins. Both of them, they're definitely, you know, they have their biases. But yeah, I find it interesting with the research and the, you know, containment research. I suppose that uh,
yeah.
one of them is talked about. But off track, off track.
It is on track, and also in relation to what it is on track because he mentioned that here in the text, and also I think in relation to what you said, there was like a kind of like a soft mention here in the text that we read about class, the idea of class. So he refutes it from the ecological perspective that speaks instead about material realities and in the danger of being slightly obnoxious of mentioning Deleuze and Guattari over and over again. I'm not just deeply enjoying working through their work, but also I feel like they're very important thinkers for our time. Um,
Yeah.
in Anti-Oedipus, they are talking about how the idea of class as like a stratified, stabilized thing is in itself um, kind of. Oh yeah, Franco said we might have to read the Luz next. I will take a few more years before I will feel confident to lead reading of the Luz. Right now, I feel like I'm very much working through it, and yeah, it takes a few years to start. Um, it's pretty heavy philosophically. So if we have other academics who are pretty involved with this work for a bunch of time, I would love to start another thing and be a student of it. Um, anyway, they're talking about how the idea of class, um, specifically in Marx's work, is not taking into account a lot of the kind of machinic, the ways in which the notion of class itself doesn't really point towards like how should I articulate it? I hope I'm not butchering it completely. That's just my level of understanding so far. But even this, the people who are in like the classes ratify a certain phenomena, but there are the individuals within the class who are moved by the same machinic processes like everybody else. And ultimately, the machine itself, the social machine, is organizing all of the so-called classes, stratas of that society. So instead measuring it in the kind of material conditions, it creates certain events, certain movements, certain actions, certain phenomena.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It brings to mind sort of the caste system, sort of how that caste system would influence the, results for people, just that are completely irrelevant to sort of being in a higher caste versus a lower caste. You sort of get into more of the karmic, uh, thought patterns of sort of that higher social system, I suppose. Uh, yeah, what came to mind.
Yeah, I think I'm not an expert on caste systems, but I think something that comes to mind that you know the when that I read when the British came to India and they saw the caste system, they immediately projected and imposed on top of it their own anthropomorphic, Eurocentric vision of, oh, they're like, oh yeah, of course. No, there is the lord, the caste, the serfs, the this, the that, and as horrible and oppressive as the Indian caste system were, it was an emergent phenomena that was vastly different than the kind of hierarchized worldview that the British brought with them. Was that has a lot more to do with kind of earlier capitalistic or primitive social codes that are deeply um, what again Deleuze and Guattari called uh, cruelty, system of cruelty. It is
Mm.
coming from the earth itself, the ingrained social codes that are inscribed on people's bodies, either with rites of passage, tattoos, things of that nature. And then the British came with their social system that came right after that, which was the feudal system, which was created after the printing press started, and it took these social codes and decoded them and or rather overcoded them in all of these social codes and turned them towards the king, the queen, the despot state, which is exactly what they did to India and everywhere else they colonized. But anyway, we're getting way off track here.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of archetypes is sort of how my brain, or I've been training my brain to think, in terms of like tarot archetypes, where like I'm not really assigning concrete value, or the king position or the queen position as a concrete, you know, dictation when I pull a tarot card, but more of a fluid archetype that anchors to the situation that I'm sort of trying to get information out of. So I don't know. It's interesting, like the controller wants to have that concrete stereotype archetype associated with large classes of people in order to control the fluid of the river that is the you know different pole positions of the king and the queen or the serfs, etc. So weird.
Would we continue a little bit more? What do you guys think?
Yeah.
I have about 30 minutes before I need to. Okay. Maybe it's a good place to stop here. Then we continue next week. Is that okay?
Yeah. Thank you for reading.
Thank you for being here, people. Does anybody else have anything else to add or to reflect before we log off?
There's one thing that's been on my mind, and I don't know if I've fully thought it out yet, but in almost all of the meetings we've had, um, dualistic thinking and binary thinking keeps coming up. Um, and for me, sometimes I gravitate towards, well, that's something we should avoid or something that needs to be overcome in some way. But as I was thinking about it, I was wondering if, we've developed this tool or process to get something. And starting to think about what that is. What are we gaining from dualistic thinking and binary thinking so that we can incorporate that into whatever's next so that we can still use that technology in some way. I'm not sure if I'm making full sense here, but there is obviously a reason why we're thinking in that way currently and why it's led to the society it's led to.
Yeah.
But yeah, just an open question, really.
I think it's a beautiful point that I'm also asking myself, and I think I would expand it even further and say it's not just us thinking. I think uh, uh, more studies in embryonic biology and like the cellular biology shows us that even cells, things that can be seen or looked at as kind of affirmation of an identity, of a singular identity, of a unique food. Um, and I find it fascinating because when I'm looking at reality around, like, seems like humans are not the only, or it will be unreasonable to imagine that humans are the only thing that can perceive these illusory, seemingly stable points of perception. And it seems to be, to me, part of the process by which becoming is happening. So in order for the infinite process of becoming to happen, have to be these like snapshots, inflection points, places in which the process kind of, um, but rather interrupted by a particular identity, a personhood, a point of perception, a historical event, like whatever, all of these kind of things. And you can think about it like water, for example. It has all of these like temperature, right? Like temperature can keep infinitely rising, but then like let's say if we talk about water, as the temperature rises or drops, it changes its stratification. It becomes from frozen to liquid to evaporation and so on and so forth. I think we can look the same thing at this perception of a self, of a particular stabilized point, of a binarity as part of the process, not something that is in opposition to it. That makes sense. Like we are meant to
Yeah.
form selfhoods, and then for these selfhoods to be dissolved and new becomings to happen. So like identity is not a bad thing. It's like a map of reality. It's something that helps us um, create meaning and meaning making and storytelling. And but when we open up what is beyond that to this kind of infinite process of identity formation and decomposition that exists throughout nature and throughout everything, and it allows us to imagine what else is possible beyond identity, beyond ideology, beyond just stratification of a social formation, beyond the changing social formation to another, from capitalism to communism or socialism or this or that. Like you can start imagining, what else is possible beyond those certifications. I don't know, just some thoughts.
Yeah, I like the sort of perceiving the observer conditions, that influences the story, right? Sort of like you're observing a natural process, with an expectation. You get a bit of that Schrodinger's, uh, get a bit of that Schrodinger's, cat in terms of like, is it? It's a bad example in this case, but like anything, the observer is the point of where the information collapses. So like understanding your reaction to a lot of, ecological processes, sort of helping guide the observer to a conclusion of the story, or sort of a gaining of wisdom in that. So like we get to the repeated, natural processes, you can have wisdom to make better decisions and how to, move or observe. But that's more of a deep inner gnosis, or the alchemist, when you talk about sort of the sublimation of different elements that also follow sort of the flux or the seasons, sort of the rock paper scissors of fire, earth, water, you know and also the interest behind like aether, sort of the etherical connection that is tapping into like the subconscious processes of uh, what the story is trying to tell you.
Also, to your point, Franco, maybe more simply, even it's a survival strategy, like making stories. Like we hear rattles in the bush, and we make a story. Oh, that's a lion. We need for survival this having a stabilized story that is lion, right? If we would
Hmm.
sit there and be like, oh, that's a process in becoming, and start philosophizing about it and develop all these, you know, I think in a very
Yeah,
simplistic way, we need that certification of an identity for sense making and survival, really. Maybe not just us, just different agents in reality. Anyway, I need to soon hop on another call. I hope it's okay if we take a little pause here, guys.